Good afternoon to everyone joining us for this webinar on the future of cross-border crisis management in Europe. My name is Landry Charrier, and I'm the Attaché for Scientific and Academic Cooperation at the French Embassy in the Netherlands, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar. Cross-border regions have been dramatically affected by measures taken in the spring of 2020 to limit the spread of the coronavirus. National borders were suddenly closed and various other restrictions were put in place, mostly without any coordination with the neighboring country. Especially for the regions that were previously regarded as well integrated, it was a surprise that measures touched them in such a way. But in fact, even before the outbreak of the pandemic, many border regions were already struggling with a plethora of unique regional obstacles. Building on the conviction that cross-border regions must be put at the very heart of European integration, our event today will reflect on the effects of the COVID-19 crisis at the Franco-German, at the Dutch-Belgian, and at the Dutch-German borders. It will discuss the ongoing and future challenges for cross-border regions and will hold a debate on the vision for cross-border cooperation as part of the future of Europe. Before starting with our discussion, I would like to introduce our moderator, and this is Jakob Ross. Jakob Ross has been a research fellow in DGAP's Franco-German Relations program since January 2022. He had initially joined the program as a research assistant in June 2021 in charge of cross-border cooperation. Previously, he worked as a research assistant at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Brussels. He had already gained experience within the Franco-German context while working at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and during his work as a parliamentary assistant to Sabine Tillet. Mr. Ross, it's great to have you here today with us. Before giving you the floor, I would also like to express my warmest thanks to our distinguished partners for their support by organizing this event, namely the Institute for Transnational and Euro-Regional Cross-Border Cooperation and Mobility at Maastricht University, represented today by Martin Unfried, the German Council on Foreign Relations, represented today by Jakob Ross, the Research Center DINAM at Strasbourg University, represented today by Birte Wassenberg, and the French Embassy in Belgium, represented today by my dear colleague, Leloup. So I leave it there. Mr. Ross, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Charrier. And just to complete, since I want to thank you for your opening of this event. Mr. Charrier is Attaché for Scientific and Academic Cooperation at the French Embassy in The Hague in the Netherlands. And we had the pleasure to work together in the past, Mr. Charrier. We co-organized another event on cross-border cooperation last summer that dealt with the shortcomings and challenges of Franco-German crisis management following the border closures in March 2020. The topic is still very much with us at DGAP and with our partners, even though currently you can get the impression that all the attention in Europe's capitals is very much focused on the developments on external borders due to the geopolitical context, especially the external borders in the eastern member states of the European Union and partner states. That's why, in my opinion, it's very important not to lose sight of the internal borders, of the internal development inside the European Union and broader Europe. And that's why I'm very happy to continue our conversation today, continue our conversation on cross-border cooperation in Europe, broadening our conversation to new partners and speakers. Here at DGAP, we published first out of our 3 studies on the Franco-German context. Last year, we will soon publish a second one. Allow me this little hint. But in my sense, there has been considerable interest in the topic due to the pandemic context. The reasons for border closures on different regions in Europe are beginning to be well researched and well described, but important work awaits both the scientific research community, but also the policy makers. The lessons learned process that has been begun and was started right after the border closures in spring 2020 is underway. It must be kept alive, and it must be kept alive at the moment, despite the risk of losing the political attention that's very much occupied with the bigger geopolitical questions. To finish this brief introduction, I want to say that in November last year, we already had the opportunity to begin this broader comparative European discussion that we want to contribute to with our event today. In November, we were at Genshagen, at the Stiftung Genshagen, and discussed cross-border cooperation in times of crisis in a Weimar Triangle format with colleagues from Poland, France, and here from Germany. I was familiar with the Franco-German context, but I learned a lot about the Polish-German cross-border cooperation back in November. And I think this is a very valuable exercise in a European context. I want to proceed this comparative approach. I'm thankful again for our partners for joining us today. And so I'm excited to present to you our excellent panel, which not only combines knowledge on different border regions in Europe, but also combines scientific knowledge on cross-border cooperation with first-hand political experience. Let me start the introduction of our panelists with Professor Birte Wassenberg. Ms. Wassenberg attended the Genshagen conference as well last November, and I'm happy to welcome you back here today. Ms. Wassenberg is a contemporary historian for international relations, working from Sciences Po in Strasbourg, France, but also working between Germany and France since a long time. She holds degrees from a British and French university, as well as from the College of Europe in Brussels. Both her doctoral thesis and her habilitation dealt with cross-border cooperation and its impact and contribution to European integration. And Ms. Wassenberg is a renowned expert for Franco-German cross-border cooperation. And I can say that I personally learned a lot from her writings, from your writings on subnational foreign policy. Next on, I'm pleased to welcome Martin Unfried, who has been working in and on a cross-border context from Maastricht in the Netherlands for many years. Mr. Unfried is a political scientist who graduated in Erlangen, Bavaria, so very far away from the German-Dutch border. But he came to Maastricht to work with the European Institute for Public Administration, where he took the lead in Maastricht then, as said by Mr. Charrier earlier, of the Institute for Transnational and Regional Cross-Border Cooperation and Mobility in 2019. So again, right before the pandemic hit Europe. Before working at ITEM, Mr. Unfried had already been employed as a Ontgrenzer for the Dutch province of Limburg and the Dutch Ministry of Internal Affairs. And I tried to translate this in preparing our discussion today, but I couldn't really find a satisfying translation. So I would personally be curious to hear what Ontgrenzer means exactly, Mr. Unfried. To complement this aggregated academic experience, we thought it useful to also invite a practitioner, both of European or bilateral foreign affairs and cross-border cooperation. That's why I'm particularly thankful that Alain de Muyser, Secretary General of the Benelux Union, found the time to join us today from Brussels, if I'm informed right, where the Benelux Union is based. Mr. de Muyser studied law in France, Germany, and Luxembourg before beginning his career as a civil servant in Luxembourg in the state administration. He made a career in the Foreign Service, serving at Luxembourg's embassy in Poland. I'm only giving a few stations here as Deputy Permanent Representative at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg as well, and later as Economic Director back at the Ministry in Luxembourg. Mr. de Muyser also served as ambassador to Portugal and Cape Verde before joining the Benelux Union as Deputy Secretary General. Finally, in 2020, he became Secretary General of the Benelux Union. So again, right before the pandemic hit the European continent. Now, after presenting to you our panelists, I would like to kick off our discussion on European cross-border cooperation, the respective experience that our experts bring to this discussion from different border regions. And I would like to do so by inviting our speakers to provide a brief opening statement. And I would suggest that we start in Strasbourg with Ms. Wassenberg. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. As you have said, Jakob, thank you for the presentation also. In our border region, I am in charge of looking into the history and the development of cross-border cooperation. And so I have done a lot of research about this border region and about the good governance that has been developed between France and Germany. I'm more familiar with the Upper Rhine region, which also involves the Swiss regions. But of course, the neighboring region, the La Grande Région, is just as a good example of cross-border governance. So throughout my whole career as a researcher, I have actually come to the conclusion that cross-border structures and governance in Franco-German border regions are a best practice example of how you should live and how you can best manage and how you can integrate border regions. And then the pandemic came and there was a big moment of bordering and of frustration and of closure of borders and of paralysis of border regions. And this had made me reflect on my analysis, thinking that maybe I took it too much for granted, that cross-border structures and cross-border governance is resilient to crisis management. There have been already crises of bordering after the migration and the terrorist crisis 2015 that I had observed, and I could observe it also as a cross-border worker because I live on the German side and I go to Strasbourg to work. So I was actually a witness of these border closures, but nothing had been very systematic until the pandemic in 2020, and the first problems of that border closure and the systematic one was that it revealed that maybe we have to rethink our view on this best practice model and look for what makes cross-border cooperation resilient. What are the factors, and how can we? How should we also compare with other border regions? Because and this is very good that we took this initiative today, because in other border regions, the cross-border resilience functioned better in the first moment. We could see that at the Polish-German border region. There was more resilience, at least at the start. And so I think a comparative approach is very useful in order to be able to look today at what do we need to make cross-border cooperation and cross-border regions well equipped to confront not only good times of European integration, but also crisis moments of European integration.
Thank you very much. Mr. Unfried, Ms. Wassenberg talked about the resilience maybe the lack thereof at the Franco-German border. How did things look like at the German-Dutch border, and how did you experience the border closures, or not closures in your case, in 2020?
Now, of course, I guess years ago, we also thought that we have the best world of all in terms of a cross-border governance system. And I have to say, we were also rather surprised when there were the border restrictions, especially between the Netherlands and Belgium. How come and how this does it could happen that we will see behind my house, 200 meters from my house, is the Belgian border. And there was really also a blockade. You could not even walk or have a bicycle tour. So that was a real surprise. But I mean, we looked into certain effects and also the governance, you could say, failure in border regions. And I have to say, you have probably to analyze also all the different levels of governance. We really have to see that we have to deal with three handicaps at three different levels of governance if we would like to understand why cross-border solidarity was so difficult in this crisis. And the first is, of course, that we see there was a lack of European harmonization in the health sector as such. And if you compare that to animal diseases, of course, you would be surprised that it's, of course, not possible that every member state is just inventing measures if there is a certain animal disease. No, there is a sort of harmonized way to tackle that. And that's a good way to say, yes, it did not come out of the blue. It was also because there was non-harmonization at the European level. So no common measures with respect to a certain infection rate, for instance. And then you come to the national level, and there, of course, you could see that, and that depends then really on the situation of neighboring countries, that, of course, then if there is no European harmonization, you need bilateral agreements, or in the case of the Benelux, you have to be prepared at this neighboring country level. And also there, I think also Alain de Muyser was certainly also surprised to see also Benelux Union did not have the right tools, more or less, in the first place for such a crisis. And we also learned that between Germany and the Netherlands, there was no protocol on exchange of patients, for instance. And we saw that even between the Netherlands and Belgium, it was even worse than between the Netherlands and Germany, that it was not possible to avoid border restrictions in the first place. So that is, of course, you could say also a crisis of subsidiarity, because everyone would say, yeah, but it's good that we do not do that at the European level. It's better that we do that at the level of the member states. But I'm afraid that was a misjudgment. It was not good that it was not harmonized. And then you come to the regional cross-border territory level. And also there you have to say, we saw that in our border region, which is very complex, that we had excellent networks cross borders of hospitals, for instance, but because of national steering of the crisis, suddenly also the cross-border networks and structures were more or less also to some extent prevented from functioning properly. And there you have a mix of then the three levels where you can see what are the handicaps at what level, and why is it, for instance, then at the French-German border, why was it different? Why was it different between Belgium and the Netherlands, or Germany and the Netherlands? And there we can discuss what are there the difficult and the individual, let's say, individual handicaps that we saw.
Thank you very much. Mr. de Muyser, you are seated in a sense between the European level, where we just heard that there was a lack of coordination, and the bilateral level, where there were big difference across the European Union and Europe in the response. Could you give us a sense, give our audience a sense of how things played out in the Benelux Union in the first months, but also maybe in the following months, following the immediate border closures and restrictions? Thank you.
With pleasure, I would do that, and I'm happy to be present as you said, a practitioner. Personally, I am already more than 10 years in the Benelux, and I've been even before. I've been associated within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Luxembourg to setting up a rapid response team to international crises, and that's why it is indeed very relevant. Now, the question which you pose, I thought we would go into much more detail. I can elaborate on it in what the response to Benelux was or is as such. But I thought that before that, speaking of experience, I might as well give you a couple of hints of what I believe as near the practitioner I sensed in the terms of that you're never prepared to a crisis. You can do whatever you want. And I heard Mrs. Wassenberg speak of comparative approach, where I would say, yes, indeed, that is necessary, but you need a little bit more. And that little bit more is certainly one can speak of preparedness, but I summarized it by, I think, 3 or 4 things which are important. And the first one which we noticed was to say that be it in the Benelux, be it in the European Union, be it everywhere, what you need is the relationship to persons. It's a little bit, and I'll be very provocative, like Henry Kissinger in saying, give me a telephone number and then I know who I can call, is exactly that. When you're in the midst of a crisis, you need to be able to rapidly call up your counterpart and know that he's there. And not because you have thousands of decisions to take at a certain point, and you need to be able in the cross-border to be very able to find him. And that's why you need to set up a good network and keep it updated as such. And I think I'm talking both now of our experiences during the pandemic and more generally in the 10 years which I'm doing. But then the second one is actually to keep up as well a list of the threats, crisis, which may occur, because it is on that basis where you will be able to do something and to respond or to send out your first responders to a situation. We did it in 2016. The Benelux gathered such a list, and I was looking this morning at it. There are 73 possible risks in 26 types of crises which were identified, with the 10 most serious ones, and they're still very relevant. If you talk of, for instance, the first one identified was blackout, the second one, epidemic infectious diseases, the third one, contamination risks. If you look at them, and that is true, and I agree with Manfred in saying you should be prepared, and you're not. You've made up a lot of possibilities of risk, and you still continue to need to set up protocols, mechanisms which can work. Which brings me basically in those mechanisms brings me to the third thing, which I see is a problem in cross-border relationship whenever you talk of crisis, is the legal instruments which you need. One thing is to say, I'm going to send you my fire brigade, for instance, if there's a fire. The second one is to know that those guys will not be hampered by restrictions at the border where you have someone stopping them and say, oh no, you can't cross here, or even be it let's say any other. We had the case with helicopter trying to cross a border for immediate health care, or we had the healthcare ambulances which could not pass a border. And so the problem is, long before you need to make all these kind of possibilities. And fact is, and I agree with that, and again I agree with Manfred and with Birte, that we did not have, let's say, the full extent of what a pandemic is. We did not have that in mind, and we had a lot of scenarios written out, but we had none on a pandemic and how it could work. Last but not least, let me point out to the last problem, and that is communication. You have a problem of communications, and that is nearly related to my point before, that within the teams. So the Belgian or the Dutch team and the German team, or the Luxembourg team or the French team, do work with different frequencies with different materials, which will make it nearly impossible to communicate each with each other. That is one of the problems, but communication is as well with the population. And I'm not going to elaborate on fake news, on wrong news, but I think everyone in the room notices what or where I want to come at. But I leave a little bit to that. I think I can elaborate you afterwards a little bit more how we specifically in the Benelux elaborated, but that would take me too long here now.
Thank you very much for this initial statement. We will certainly come back to what instruments you talked about, the rules, the legal framework, what instruments are currently developed to better cope with future crises. I mean, you said that you're prepared, at least on paper, for 72 different scenarios. But I would like to go back to Strasbourg, to Ms. Wassenberg, and ask you. You have conducted extensive research, and you just said in your opening statement as well that there's a very broad network of cooperation, of contacts. Mr. de Muyser just underlined the importance of individual contacts. How do you explain the initial failure? I mean, you did so, and we don't want to stick too much on the border closures, since this event is also here to look into the future and to discuss solutions. So maybe if you could develop a bit more, what has changed since spring 2020? What has changed for the better? What has been done to improve bilateral cooperation between France and Germany? And maybe where have the Germans and the French learned from other European partners and regions?
Yes, maybe to just say a word about why, what was the problem in the crisis here in this border region. I think there were two important problems. First one was, and this was a surprise, just as Manfred has also stated, is that cross-border structures were paralyzed and did not function. And we have a lot of them here. We have them on the executive, on the parliamentary level. We have institutions for citizens in the border region, and all of them were paralyzed. So that was the first problem. And the second problem was concerned the population, the border population, because we had in this border region, and this was also a surprise, what we call ressentiment, resentments against the Alsatian border workers. And the long period of Franco-German reconciliation, which is also always very much mediatized with the Treaty of Élysée, and which had just been reformed and put forward even more with the Treaty of Aachen in 2019. This put a big question mark on this border region. Now, what has why did this happen, and what have we already done against this? So first of all, the paralysis was the analysis has been done quite well since the first border closure in 2020. It was, in my opinion, first of all, due to the fact that we did not have a cross-border institution here, which was thought multi-level, as Manfred said. Multi-level in the sense local and regional actors from both sides of the border, plus the national authorities. Because as Manfred said, the European level did not really intervene. There was no coordination. And so it was the national authorities, and they did not think of the border regions, and they did not consult with the local authorities or regional authorities, and with the cross-border institutions. And this has been changed very rapidly after the first phase of the crisis by a new ad hoc working group, which did exactly this. It was under the impulsion of the German Länder, the border Länder towards France, and they involved cross-border institutions, plus, of course, the Région Grand Est, and enabled what Alain has put forward, a permanent communication and a structured discussion about what to do. So this was helped to organize transfers of patients, but the ad hoc group still is working now. And so they can now think about how to put into place mechanisms to respond to what Alain has proposed as a list of crises. So this is in fact a new cross-border governance structure, which is multi-level in this sense. Regarding the resentment of the population, it is more difficult because this needs to be investigated more in terms of, I would say, a long-term approach. It's us historians would have to look into, how deep has the reconciliation process been in this border region. My hypothesis is that Franco-German reconciliation has worked really well on a bilateral level, but that in border regions it's more difficult because border regions are placed at the border where the scar of history, where resentment is maybe more is still present maybe today, and so it can come up again very quickly, and we have seen this in the pandemic. So what can we do against this? This is creating confidence and making cross-border the population need or still working on more projects, maybe in the cultural and in the educational level, projects which have been a little bit neglected by all the Interact programs of the European Union, because they had focused much more on the economic surplus value and not on the surplus value in terms of European integration or the European idea or about confidence in the population. What we can say also in comparison with other border regions, we've been working already in our network, in the TAIN network, where we have 10 border regions represented. And we have seen that we have identified so far, it's actually Elżbieta Opilaska from the German Polish border region who has done first research on this. 3 factors which are fostering resilience in border regions. The first one is the personal links, and that has been put forward by Alain de Muyser. You have to establish, there has to be not only institutions, but also people who believe in this integration and who know each other and who can then react to crisis. But there are also, the second element are institutions. We need the institutionalization is also a guarantee against for resilience. And the third level is really important. That's for the citizens also. There has to be confidence. We have to, because if the confidence is lost in the neighbor or in the European integration process, then we do have a problem for crisis management. So this is as far as we have got for the moment in our research, so what we can do in order to foster resilience in cross-border regions.
Thank you very much for this insight on what has been done in the Franco-German context. I would now like to pass to Martin Unfried and ask you, I mean, you already said that you are confronted in a way with 2 cross-border contexts, the German Dutch one and the Dutch Belgian one. I think, and this includes me, many people were surprised that while the Franco-German border was severely traffic was severely restricted, nearly closed down, that in the Dutch-German context it remained fairly open. How do you explain this, and has there been a comparable process as the one in the Franco-German context, as Ms. Wassenberg just explained, since the beginning of the pandemic?
Yeah, certainly there were some improvements after the first shock, you could say, especially in the Dutch-Belgian relations. And it came as a surprise that also you could say the governance system of the Benelux was not prepared to enable that, let's say, also the talks in the first place to avoid restrictions. It was, of course, a bit also a surprise that it was a prime minister from North Rhine-Westphalia at the time, Mr. Laschet, who more or less organized a crisis team at the level of ministries where North Rhine-Westphalia and Belgium and the Netherlands came together, and that there is still a task force that was at the level of ministries, and I think they still come together once a week in this setting. And of course, that also shows that probably, as Alain said, yes, you need also to know people, but apparently you need also to have a sort of procedure. If this is a crisis, then you have procedure 1, 2, 3, or a protocol, and then you come together at the level of the Benelux. That will be now interesting, of course, how to define also a crisis scenario team for the next crisis. But it was also interesting to see that, I mean, we had the same federal legislation also for the German parts in Baden-Württemberg, close to France, as we had here with the Netherlands or to Belgium. Nevertheless, you saw that also a Prime Minister like Mr. Laschet made a difference, because he comes from Aachen. He was really convinced that the border is not a sort of instrument to fight the pandemic. And that's why there were also interesting, apparently, agreements with, for instance, the federal police, Bundespolizei, not to control, even if you had the same rules, only if it's an essential travel, then you could pass the border. But there was an interesting concept of non-controlling at the border of North Rhine-Westphalia. And that was really much up to a person or a government at the moment. And the Dutch connection to North Rhine-Westphalia was also well established in a process that is going on for a couple of years, also a sort of structure and governance system. But I'm very surprised that we do not really talk about also improvements at the European level. I'm really surprised that we do not talk about what is a health union about, and what should be also there a next level of harmonization, because there's a paradox that the cross-border regions would benefit from more European harmonization, because you saw that with quarantine rules, with testing rules, with travel restrictions. If that is not harmonized, it's the border region who suffers, because we are still today faced with a very complex situation, which leads to some discrimination, because it's not about the infection rate, it's about the national border, why you are not allowed to go to Aachen, or you have to quarantine if you come from Aachen and you go to Maastricht. So I'm a bit surprised that we do not really also talk more about the European instruments, and why we also at the national level do not talk about, for instance, the spreading of patients. If it's not harmonized at the European Union, why is there not a plan? How can we really have a structured system of health cooperation of hospitals where we also share intensive care capacities? And I think that is really very important, that we have the protocols, rules, agreements beforehand at the level of the Benelux, at the level of bilateral treaties, and then also in a border region.
Thank you very much. I hope that we at DGAP and others for sure will contribute to this discussion. I mean, we are publishing our health study soon. I'm certainly, I would agree that better European coordination would have been beneficial at the initial phase of the pandemic, and has been ever since. That should be a topic for the future. There were discussions that under the French Council presidency currently underway, this could eventually become a focus. We've not heard as much so far, but maybe to stay with this question on more European cooperation, Mr. de Muyser, I would like to ask you, as a former diplomat of Luxembourg, and now working closely with Luxembourg. Some years ago, Luxembourg introduced the idea of a European cross-border mechanism, ECBM, that was developed to resolve legal and administrative obstacles in cross-border contexts. The mechanism did not convince a majority of member states in the European Union, apparently. It is now been left aside. In light of the failure to push forward the ECBM for now, what would be other innovative ideas and mechanisms maybe on the European level, but also from the viewpoint of the Benelux Union, that could be introduced and discussed going forward?
That is a wide question. Let me start with ECBM indeed, because in stressing that the Benelux has never been associated to the setting up per se of this ECBM, but I understand that the idea was good, to be able to find a mechanism which would help in cross-border situation to allow, in fact, basically that the law of the country would allow the law of the other country to be on a voluntary basis effective there. Fine. The idea is absolutely amazing, and I might say that everyone should clap at that idea. But immediately behind it, you will have reservations. The first one, as we're talking of crisis management, is in terms of crisis management. As I stated before, in saying that would mean that on each level of decision in the other country is known that the law of the other country would work. And that is already, don't need to talk about the communication of that, but that is already rather complicated, and you're not terribly sure how you can do it. The other problem is the whole of the constitutional problems which are attached to it in saying, would you need a comparative study, law study, to find out if it is possible, and if the rules which are ours, and I do agree that there are certain differences which exist. Finally, the Benelux is in fact taking a different approach in saying we do not want that a law of one country is applicable in the other country. We want to have a discussion on finding kind of hotspots of law in between the two countries, so as to make to look at the various possibilities which for citizens, for businesses, it could work, that they don't have red tapes to take with. But here is something which is really to be asked as such, which is complicated. And then my third problem with, let's say, ECBM, when I look at it, is much more the question of I've nothing against the dynamic of EU bodies. I've personally been in Coreper as well as Luxembourg diplomat as well. But you know that in between, let's say, the Council representing the countries, the Parliament, which is representing the whole of the EU, and the Commission, or the citizens and the Commission, the various interests will make it that each one wants to take out something which is a little bit different. In other words, you're watching down a possibility which makes it that ECBM becomes, at the end, only a kind of tool of coordination in between various countries, which is not the aim which it should have. And again, there, I think the question, and I'm following Manfred in here, is that you have to recognize crisis management remains or has to remain at the local level, i.e. at the national level. I agree that you have various instances at European level, but you have to realize as well that the local level does not work against the EU level. And that's why, for instance, during the Belgian presidency last year of Benelux, the Belgian Crisis Center, with the help of their two Benelux colleagues, proposed to Europe the setting up of a network of director generals of the center crisis. Why? Because they would believe that they do not work against it, but in complement to what exists. So EPCR, which is the political way of dealing with crisis, does not deal with the practical things of the crisis. We're not only talking of pandemic, we're talking as well of, for instance, hybrid threats or flooding or fires, and there you need a totally different type of approach. And there, with all the mechanisms which exist, you do have a problem. That means, in other words, yes, that it was a creation of a new body, but it was a creation of a subsidiary new body. In fact, what you're looking at is in saying it is not to reinvent something, it is to have a strategic body which can oversee the other bodies which exist and direct them with more coherence in what they're doing. because otherwise you will end up with 15 avenues of crisis management, which are done in parallel and not in coherent set together. This is just to launch. I'm very open to continue that discussion because I know it's rather provocative in what I'm saying.
Thank you. I mean, that's what we seek, and that's what we hope for in the future discussion as well. Mr. Unfried, if you want to react directly to this, and then I would like to bring it back to the Franco-German context, maybe with Ms. Wassenberg.
Mm. Yes, because we did also last year a big study on crisis management at different levels during the Corona crisis. And of course, you can see it was a good idea to have a task force, crisis task force at the level of the governments with North Rhine-Westphalia. But there, for instance, you could say it was a good start, but it was in principle not to coordinate measures. What they did was more or less solving problems afterwards, because of non-coordination of measures. Then they looked in what is the problem for commuters, and then they looked for solutions, which was also good. But you could also say such a crisis management team at this level could also better look into the coordination of measures beforehand. And we looked also into the regional crisis management teams. And there we saw there was a big difference. We have an excellent emergency network in our cross-border region called EMRIC. And for instance, for industrial accidents, they have excellent protocols. So they have even a plan how to spread patients if there is a big accident. And there you saw that because of a lack of protocols, they could not really benefit from the network, because there was then suddenly national steering of crisis teams. But you can do something about it. You can now also say what should be done at which level and how can we improve. So we made a proposal to say, yes, we should also have a cross-border regional crisis team. And there you have very carefully to see who is in such a team with the right competences at the regional local level and what could be the function finally. But we have to discuss that at different levels, what could be then the benefit of the crisis teams cross-border.
Thank you. And since Mr. Unfried could react to Mr. de Muyser, I will give the same opportunity to you, Mr. de Muyser, please. You're now muted, so yeah.
Sorry. No, I just wanted to add something because it is very important, this creation of bodies which exist. And that's why I wanted just to react to one thing which I heard before by my two colleagues, which was saying we were paralyzed. In fact, we were not paralyzed. Or we had the procedures which were done. The problem is really a problem of countries in a way, and in nearly what I would call a Cornelian choice. At the beginning of the crisis, what happened? The countries go into lockdown, which is what was the decision which had to be taken. Obviously, each country goes into lockdown. And then comes immediately straight afterwards a consultation at Benelux level in saying, fine, we will open the borders between Netherlands and Belgium, or Netherlands and Luxembourg, and Belgium and Luxembourg. But with that, we then need to invent a kind of Benelux fortress, because we're just expanding it. And so the choice, as I said, was rather complicated for the three countries in that they said, but if we do a lockdown and we keep it to there, we in fact create a kind of, yes, Benelux, it's seen as a country. That is possible in a country like France or Germany, which is a big one. And here you would create an entity which would be just as big. And so you have to invent new ways of communication. And one of these, and that's why I'm just going to point out, is that we created 3 platforms, which was one at Foreign Affairs, the second one was crisis management, and the third one was health, which actually each week are communicating together. And immediately afterwards, after having created it, the request was to make it not Benelux, but make it regional. And that's why we have now communication with North Rhine-Westphalia, with the greater region, la Grande Région, and with the Hauts-de-France, which meet at a very regular basis, and I could expand on what exactly the purpose of these platforms are, but basically they are there to, the problem which I called at the beginning, the Cornelian choice, free movement of workers, to allow that and to see how response could be. We had very successful, for instance, for maritime workers, we had to intervene in Berlin. All the ambassadors went there to try and force a decision, because the Rhine obviously is going into the Netherlands and is very important for the Dutch colleagues. But the Luxembourgers and the Belgians were very, very happy to collaborate with that. Sorry that I didn't intervene so long on that point.
No, thank you. Talking about new bodies, new institutions, I would go like to go back to the Franco-German context, since in parallel to the ECBM discussions ongoing on the European level, as you already mentioned, Ms. Wassenberg, there was the setup of the Aachen Treaty, which specifically focuses on cross-border or regional cooperation in its 4th chapter. You had the setup of the cross-border committee. You had regular meetings by parliamentarians. How did these institutions and new legal instruments, as well in this 4th chapter of a bilateral treaty between France and Germany, how did those play a role? Did they play a role in the pandemic, and how could they continue to play a role, or a more important role in the future, and probably serve as an example for other European border regions again?
Well, that's a little bit a tricky question, because the problem with the Treaty of Aachen was that it was signed just 3 months before the beginning of the pandemic. So it was, so they have still not been able to put all the structures in place by now, and it was for them very difficult to intervene in the crisis, but they did at least on 2 levels. The first level was the parliamentarian level, because we had the setting out of this joint parliamentary assembly, and they did the work in terms of lobbying together for maintaining borders open, for example, for pushing the national states, but also European Union to propose new measures for health, for a coordinated or common health policy, so that they did their political job, and so in this, but of course it's on a parliamentary level, and on the executive level, this cross-border, I would say that the ad hoc group was not set up first in the framework of the Treaty of Aachen, but it was then canalized into this cross-border committee that you mentioned, Jakob, and they are working now. And as I said before, I mean, this is the place where they could now make interesting proposals how to operate in future and to do crisis management. But the Treaty of Aachen, I mean, the interesting part of it is that it proposes a kind of something that the European mechanism, the possibility of law extending onto the other side is proposed here for the Franco-German context. And for the moment, this has not been implemented yet. And so we are kind of waiting for projects or for either, because it's supposed to be functional, for functional possibilities. And I think it could be if we do have a first application of this for a cross-border project in the Franco-German context, then this would maybe, my hope is that this would take away some of the hesitations of the member states who are resisting the European mechanism, and I'm sure that once if you find a practical example, and it's shown that this does not put into danger the sovereignty of the states, which some states actually fear, then maybe you can get this European mechanism for the whole Europe working again. But I mean, it still is a challenge, because it's not that easy to propose concrete projects for the extension of the national law, even if it's only for functional elements. As Alain has pointed out, it poses a lot of difficulties, but I believe, contrary maybe to his point of view, that it would still facilitate enormously cross-border cooperation if such a mechanism is put into place on a European level. We have signed and put up a manifesto, Jakob, you were involved, in order to invite the member states of the European Union to take up again this mechanism, and because it would facilitate, for example, public services in cross-border areas. It would facilitate a lot in the cross-border areas. Just one point that I would mention also with regard to the discussion between Martin and Alain before, is that the whole question is, do we really need just tools on the European level? I mean, we have a new Schengen code now. Do we need a European way of managing crisis only, or do we not need some coordination on the European level and then specific institutions and tools on each border region? Because I am always of the opinion that in cross-border regions are also very specific, and that you cannot kind of find common tools for all border regions. And it might sometimes, I mean, I'm not saying that it made sense in 2020 in spring to leave the border open between Germany and the Netherlands and North Rhine-Westphalia, and to close it between France and Germany. But sometimes you might need differentiated policies in border regions concerning problems that are not present in. You cannot always compare, and I think that's and I think if the national states have understood one thing during the crisis, is that the border regions are borderlands, kind of in between regions, where you do need these specific maybe exceptional rules, where you have to provide specific policies also, and they might not be the same if we're looking at the Polish, German, Danish, or the Franco-German border.
Right. I think that was something that became clear both in the Congress in Strasbourg and in Genshagen as well. The specificities of border regions should not be neglected, even though we're trying to set up something European and common. Mr. de Muyser, I don't know if your hand was still up, if you wanted to react, or...
Well, yes and no, but I don't want to take all the floors here. But I'm following fully Mr. Wassenberg on the question that we are in a setting of multi-level governance, and that's why we do need both the European level and the regional level. The question is here, and that's the point which I was trying to make before in saying what we have to define is more the role of who is doing what. If the European role is taking over nearly as wanting to manage, as really crisis management here, as managed the crisis on European level, that will not work. It cannot work because situation is fully different as such. But if you take it that you can put it on a level which is beyond, and meaning on the cross-border level, then it can work. A much better work. Sorry, that was just my input.
All right, Mr. Unfried, then, and I would like to follow up with a question to you after your commentary.
Yes, I entirely agree that we need flexible solutions also due to the border situation. But I analyzed that there was a sort of also crisis of subsidiarity, meaning that the non-harmonization at the European level was not compensated by good national bilateral agreements. And we did not see also at the regional level, cross-border, there that they could also then be flexible. If it's not regulated from above, you could say also then a Euro region could also then do more. And there, I think we saw that with our hospitals. Our hospitals at the German-Dutch-Belgian border have excellent relations, also with respect to different units, but they were more or less prevented from cooperation during the COVID crisis. And that was because of national steering and not more or less allowing, due to the subsidiarity principle, that they look for good cross-border solutions. And there I'm totally with Birte. Yes, of course, we have to make sure that during the next crisis also we can have flexible solutions in border regions, and in comparison also, or in relation to the right level of governance where we see also improvements.
Thank you. And I mean, just to share one insight maybe from the first study we published, I mean, we saw the emergence of more multi-level governance, in the Franco-German context, at least within this cross-border cooperation committee, where you suddenly had representatives of the national governments from Berlin and Paris sitting with local authorities, with mayors, and there was a direct contact. The question now being, how can this be preserved and institutionalized? And but I want, and maybe we can come to an end for this first round of the discussion and open up to questions afterwards. But I wanted to know, I already said earlier that there was a big question whether France would or not take cross-border cooperation as a priority, or at least work on that during the council presidency. The cross-border cooperation is mentioned a couple of times in the new coalition treaty on the national level in Berlin. I saw, Mr. Unfried, that you recently signed an open letter to the Dutch government with regards to their new policies, and wanted to ask you what would your or what were the demands, since it was in Dutch. I was unfortunately not able to read it, but what were the essential demands that you made, or the observations you shared with Dutch policymakers from a research perspective?
There were a lot of open letters sent to the Dutch government lately, so it's sometimes difficult to, because also a lot of municipalities joined, and there are different also aspects. There was one open letter only with respect to the working at home problem, because that is extremely relevant for our cross-border commuters. But in general, we wrote an article in a national Dutch newspaper going through the coalition agreement in the Netherlands, and we saw that that was a missed opportunity, because a lot of, for instance, building up better relations of hospitals, and also coming to a cross-border agreement on, for instance, the spreading of patients in a future crisis. We can't see that. We cannot also see that the Dutch government is now really describing what is a health union in the European Union, and what are the aspects that are, from a Dutch perspective, very important. So we summed up some elements where we do not really see that the idea of cross-border crisis management is really understood at the moment, how important it is to come now with protocols, to come now with, for instance, a Benelux initiative, to have their new agreements for the future.
Thank you. Just as statements and open letters were signed in the Franco-German context, as Ms. Wassenberg said earlier. I would now like to open up the floor and give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions to our speakers. I haven't seen any in the chat as of yet, but please feel free to ask these questions. Please feel free to request the floor as well. We would be happy to take your question live and in color here as well. And if there's none, I will continue to ask my questions. So please. All right. Well, since there's no question now, don't be shy, please. I will give back the floor to Mr. de Muyser. Maybe you have the question for your fellow speakers as well.
Well, it's more a comment or food for thought, which I want to launch, which we haven't talked too much about here, but it is basically to say one of the problematic which we found in real life as we were progressing was the absence of analytic capabilities of knowing exactly what was happening. In other words, that in between the various institutions across the borders, that you had other material which you would receive, be it on the epidemiological level or others, that you had nothing which gives you exactly the precise same picture on one side and on the other side of the border, making it that much more difficult to actually elaborate solutions or to try and work together. I agree with Martin, for instance, on the fact of the hospitals, but you had such strange or with times responses on one side of the border of the other, that you weren't really aware of the capabilities of a hospital in a given cross-border region. Is it full, or is there still possibilities to bring over a patient as such? Using it as an example of showing that there were a lot of problems which we had to have, in fact, what I call a data-driven decision-taking, and not an emotional-driven decision-taking. And that is one of the problems which I see in the aftermath of this crisis, in saying we have to work on it, we have to find much more. In other words, we have to associate much more the scientific side with the practitioner side. For the moment, I have the impression we each work on our lessons learned, and each one is going to say, this is what we're going to make better next time, or next time. But we're not really trying to put it together in saying, okay, let's really work out. Sorry, that was again a little bit provocative. I'm not sure if Manfred or Birte wants to react to that.
No, thank you. And if I may jump in here and just provide one other example that really underlines what you just said, Mr. de Muyser. In our first study, we talk about the spatial planning process that's ongoing in the Franco-German context. There are several initiatives to look at spatial planning in a binational cross-border setting. So I think that's something new. I'm not sure that that's linked to the pandemic context, but I would very much agree that there's a big need of shared data, of knowing how many people cross the border, in what context. I remember one health expert telling us basically, if you have patients going from France to Germany, they disappear oftentimes at the border. We don't know where they go because of data sharing restrictions as well. So that's definitely one point that I would underscore from our viewpoint as well, that there's a big need to bring together scientific research, academic research, and policymakers, and to combine these. But yeah, sorry, I don't know if Mr. Unfried or Ms. Wassenberg wants to react to this.
Yeah, I would like to react to this because I find it a difficult point, because data you're talking about quantitative data, but I'm personally working more with qualitative data, and I think in cross-border context it makes always sense because it's not sufficient to know how many people cross or how many or are they able to cross, and what are the controls. I'm participating in one of the projects led by Canada, Borders and Globalization, on that subject, but for me that's never sufficient. You need to know about why they cross and how and what are their feelings. I mean, emotions are important in a cross-border context. This is what gave the resentments, and so you cannot capture the emotions or you cannot analyze really deeply what happens and what consequences a crisis have for the cross-border population. Also, if you don't take into account qualitative analysis. And what practitioners sometimes do not understand, and this is, I say this as a historian, is we need time. You cannot do that. I mean, I'm personally, if you want to do this seriously, you cannot, have say, okay, in a week I will give you all my. And so, if I want to be serious, I take at least a year to do a study where I go into the archives, and where maybe, or even if you are in other disciplines like Martin, if you want to do interviews, it has to be representative. It just takes time, and it's good if it takes time, and then we need to find ways how to confront these results with the practitioners in the region.
Yeah, we looked also into the data question, and we had a project called Pandemic. It was an Interact funded project, and there was also one part building up a cross-border dashboard, also with respect to the infection rates. And because it was also a surprise, of course, that in the first place, it was in a cross-border territory, very difficult to see what is the actual infection situation across the border in the cross-border territory, because in the first place, all the data were very national. And the measures were, of course, also then more or less due to the national numbers and situations. So there was an improvement. We have now such a dashboard cross-border, but it's still a different thing, and we are not sure. There is also a question of, for instance, definitions. For instance, infection rate is not infection rate, because sometimes the definitions were different, and also the procedures. Even death rate, we also looked into that. How to measure COVID-related death was also difficult because there were different definitions. Also, there's a lot of work to do in the future for this detailed cross-border assessments to improve the data quality.
And here again, I would like to underscore the fact that, I mean, what's being learned in the context of the pandemic with regards to pandemic countering pandemic measures is also valuable for many other fields, as you pointed out earlier, Mr. de Muyser. If a fire worker wants to cross the border and there's no common definition on operating principles, or there's no common legal framework, that's the exact, or that's an even worse problem if that doesn't exist. So I think that's a good example to say what we learn now in the pandemic context with regards to health policies, data sharing will potentially be very good in many other areas, and will contribute to better cross-border cooperation. I now see that a colleague of mine, Annalena Kirch, has raised her hand. She's working on urban diplomacy, and I'm happy to hear from you, Annalena, your question to our speakers.
Yes, thank you very much also for the interesting discussion. I have a question on these projects that Birte Wassenberg mentioned in the context of the Aachen Treaty. I'm not aware of the exact wording, but it sounded to me like one of the innovative elements is that you could have cross-border projects with legal reach then also beyond the border, and that could facilitate and serve as innovation hubs or whatever. And I was wondering, because you mentioned so far there are no projects in practice, what the structure behind this is, if very good project ideas are on their way, who the central actors are in this exercise, and what the scope is. Is it very broad, like everything that relates to cross-border cooperation, or if the idea is to have some strategic focus areas like, I don't know, health cooperation, climate adaptation, or whatever. So that would be very interesting to hear.
Yeah, well, I have to disappoint you because I'm not part of the working group of the Treaty of Aachen, so I don't know what actually what they are thinking about. I'm more thinking, I can just tell you that personally, from my research side, with my colleague from the Hochschule Kehl, Joachim Beck, we have an idea. We want to propose a project for the application of this Aachener Treaty, which is we want to create an integrated Franco-German research center. And we don't know whether we want to use the French law or the German law yet, but this is as a project to see how we can use this mechanism and make it work. So that's but this is just an idea for the moment that Birte Wassenberg and Joachim Beck have. Nobody actually, you are the first one to know about it. And so I'm not sure whether there are other projects. I believe that for the moment, the cross-border working group is not really focusing on these issues. They are more focusing on what to propose in terms of better coordination of health services. But that's not the idea of using the law for another on the other side.
Maybe following up on that, if you, Mr. de Muyser, or Mr. Unfried, are you aware of any other examples in your specific border regions of instruments or concrete propositions for this kind of legal experiments to implement a solution across a border and making a kind of exception from national law. I know that there's a health cooperation that's very much developed or very deeply developed between France and Belgium, but could you provide us with other examples, maybe from your context? Yeah, Mr. Unfried, to start with you, maybe.
Yes, I also have to give credits to the Benelux, because we looked into different arrangements, and under Benelux law or some of the framework conventions, some of the elements are already possible. We have, for instance, a cross-border industrial site between Maastricht and Lanaken in Belgium, and they have more or less done something on noise standards in order to say, yes, we will use also, I think the methodology to measure it is a bit deviating from the Dutch approach, more in line with the Belgian approach in a cross-border context. So there we saw that under Benelux legislation, you can already do something like what is meant by the European cross-border mechanism. So it is a very good, that's why when we always see these B-solution cases from DG Regio, and we always say, yes, we have to look, for instance, into the framework conventions of the Benelux, if it's possible under already existing legislation. But sometimes that's forgotten. A lot of people do not actually know what is possible with Benelux legislation.
I'm just going to compliment Martin in that sense. Indeed, yes, we do have something. Well, we have a couple of legal instruments which exist and we can be used in that context. The major one being the Benelux, which is very comparable to European grouping of territorial cooperation, which is here called the Benelux grouping of territorial cooperation, which has various ways of working together, and that might be indeed the case why I'm against ECBM, but where I say, well, within the Benelux region, we actually do already have something, and it does work. I'm for the moment currently working on one which should be between Luxembourg and Belgium in that respect. In other words, but there the idea is different. The idea is not to make that the law of one country should be kind of applicable in another country. It is to say, let's work on a common basis on how we can work and how we can make it. In other words, as well, at the intermediate level of, let's call it a Benelux legal area to be implemented. And then in that respect, you can go, and there I will even supplement Martin in there, that indeed we have conventions or treaties which exist within the three Benelux countries on, for instance, biodiversity or various other things which do actually create a single legal entity for the three countries. It goes further than just only the cross-border cooperation, because it's obviously there's ratification process, and after ratification process, it is a legal act which exists for the three countries. But we have as well the other possibility, and I always kind of hesitate in using it, is that by EU treaties we have the possibility to sometimes go further than EU law when our objectives are not met by EU law. It's the famous 350, Article 350 of Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, which has to be taken with, in French, is avec des pincettes. We have to watch out not to use it too often, but it theoretically gives us as well within the Benelux region to actually implement something which goes beyond, let's say, what the European Union can do at a certain point in time. But to revert back, indeed, the Benelux was put up in such a way that we do have the legal instruments to make nearly every possibility in between our countries possible. Fact is that I'm always seeing it is not enough to just do it at Benelux level. I cannot, and I cannot vouch for something which is just simply only the Benelux. We can make an open treaty and then allow for France, for Germany, or for others to join. but that is not enough. That does not give us a legal base, and certainly we do not want to substitute ourselves in a kind of mini Europe and then suddenly take up new forms. And that's why you see the possibilities on one side. Yes, there are options which can be made, but then the limitations as well. And those limitations are that we are working for European integration, and we want European integration to work as effectively as possible.
And maybe again here, Mr. de Muyser, I very much like the expression avec des pincettes, to be very not to go too far too quickly, since I remember talking to an expert on constitutional law who said that basically these exemptions from national law, for instance, in France, could very quickly touch upon the first principle of the French constitution, which is France is a one republic, indivisible. So you very quickly have very complicated jurisdictional debates. But I think, and that's maybe to come to a conclusion or to launch the conclusive statements as well. That's something that is debated very lively at the moment. I got the sense, we at DGAP got the sense, and throughout the different conferences, that there's a momentum, there's debates that weren't as lively in the past probably, that there's a window of opportunity, and that now the question is how to institutionalize this debate and how to really come forward with practical examples, as my colleague asked for, but as many, not only in the Franco-German context, I guess, asked for how to implement these principles of exemption in the border region. If you agree, I would now like to invite you to make a conclusive statement, maybe to try to summarize, in a sense, what you took away not only from this discussion, but from the debates that have taken place in your respective border regions, and what you would wish for, also addressing Mr. de Muyser, as you are the only representative of the policy side, but what you wish for policy decisions to come to improve cross-border solidarity in the European context, to improve cross-border cooperation. I would like to start maybe with Ms. Wassenberg again.
That's difficult. Would have had to think a little bit about a conclusion. It's what I would say is that I gained, when we were in Genshagen, I gained a lot of experience from a comparison of two border regions, the Franco-German and the Polish-German border region. And I mean, in this format of an online talk, we cannot go so much in depth, but I believe a lot from the research side in a future comparative approach. Anne Thévenet from the Euro Institute, she is online. She is heading our TAIN network. Martin is also part of this network, and we have more than 10 border regions represented. And my wish is that we manage to engage into common projects. We have some already working, but in future projects also, in order to compare the ability of cross-border regions to be resilient to cross-border crises, and see whether we can also propose some interesting outputs for this. Like we have already produced some toolkits, so maybe there could be a cool toolkit on crisis management. I have a cool toolkit which I have just published on the analysis of European crisis. So maybe one on the management would be great. That would be my hope for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Unfried. If you would go next.
Yeah, my hope is that we really do not say, okay, the pandemic is over, now we go back to business, but that we really see this as a real crisis also for the border region. And I think what Birte said, there are long-term repercussions, meaning trust in the open border, trust in that we live together here with an own identity, that is all endangered. That is really now, there was a renationalization also of the thinking. Now they come across the border and they are not allowed and things like that. So there also politicians really have to say, yes, we have to come with real measures to win back the trust. And that is not, perhaps also the thinking, for instance, a Euro region is not only a schönes Wetter thing. It's not only if everything is nice, we can have nice beaches, but the failure within a crisis is even worse, because then a lot of people have the idea, okay, the Euro region, that's just for the Sunday. But if there is a crisis, then they don't mean anything. And that is really, that we should really take that also as a challenge. And that, I come back to the question of all the different levels and really make a good analysis. What should happen now at all different levels to make cross-border crisis management better in the future, and to also come to this resilience idea.
Mr. de Muyser, from the policy side, how will you implement all of this? What could the Benelux Union contribute?
It's rather difficult because the end Mr. Wassenberg and Landry and Unfried have said most of it. But let's look at it from my side. That pandemic is not the only crisis. Indeed, we are facing a lot, and we were facing in the pandemic. We were facing other crises, be it let's say the natural crisis, or as we look at it now, we are facing a major crisis for the moment in Europe, which I will not mention as such, basically. But which means that potentially we are in Neuland, in the new land each time that we have and I would stress the thing, populations and decision takers, which are in a certain way unprepared to face those types of crises. And that's why we have to continuously make it that the efficiency and the let's say I would point out another question which we have not mentioned, but that the alarm system of crisis is rendered better as such. And then as a practitioner, you asked specifically, I will do, Benelux is a triptych, so I will do a triptych of, let's say, what I believe I shall work in as well, or continue working. Right, and then I said, the legislation which exists on our level, because all the basis is we are in a world where we need legislation au sens large in a certain way. In other words, as well our procedures and how we can work. And I'm still going to come back to it, and I accept the let's say that the information sharing or the analytic capacity of the countries has to be better, be it now quantitative, qualitative. I mean, we can do both. We don't need to do one on the other. And the third one is, and we talked just a little bit, populations and the resentment of populations. In other words, we have to do better, and we have to continuously establish channels of communication with the population to be, in a way, the dialogue with the society. In the pandemic, sorry, is a topic which we did not discuss at all, but the dialogue with society was, in a way, totally forgotten until it was suddenly taken up again. And I'm going to put this into a large bowl in saying it's the whole of the society. Last but not least, Benelux is there for the well-being of citizens. And it is that one which I'm thinking of in saying I have to take care as well of the populations in the cross-border. There are those which are the most time totally forgotten, because they're kind of seen as, well, we're going to deal with that afterwards. And it is especially those ones which are then in need, be it that they're cross workers, be it that they're just forgotten there, but specifically that the dialogue has not been maintained with them. Right.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. I would again underscore what you said last, that populations, there's a very big demand of populations, especially in border regions, to be taken more into consideration, to be included in policy making, to be heard about their problems. That's something that certainly got out of our work on our studies. And just to end, since we reached the end of the discussion, I would also underscore how helpful I found it personally to have this exchange, not only in conferences, but between research, academic research and policymakers, that there's certainly something to be done in the future as well to better connect the scientific expertise, again, be it qualitative, quantitative, with decision makers, both on the local, regional, but also on the national level, probably on the European level. I hope that we did our small contribution with our discussion today. I really hope that we continue this conversation in the future. Thank you again as well to Mr. Charrier, since this was already the second event that we co-organized on this question. I hope to stay in touch. I wish you all good luck and that well, we are finally getting out of this pandemic context and away from Zoom calls someday soon as well. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Thank you to our audience as well. And bye-bye.